Sometimes the cruelest wounds come not from enemies, but from the laughter of neighbors who've known you all your life. Elias Thorne stood in that dusty saloon, clutching a $5 bill, his only inheritance from a distant uncle, while the whole town mocked the old cowboy who'd worked honest labor all his days. They said he could finally afford a bath. They said his uncle was as worthless as he was. But Elias did something nobody expected that day. He walked straight to the stagecoach office and bought an old abandoned trunk nobody else wanted. Inside that trunk was something that would turn their laughter into silence. What could possibly change a man's entire fortune with just $5? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other morning in Redemption Springs, which is to say, it started with the slow creak of old bones and the kind of silence that settles over a man who lives alone. Elias Thorne had been awake since dawn, as he always was, not because he wanted to be, but because sleep had become a harder thing to hold on to as the years accumulated. He sat at his small kitchen table in the room he rented above the livery stable, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm, while he stared at the letter that had arrived 3 days prior. The letter was from a law office in Santa Fe, written in the precise, emotionless hand of someone who drafted such correspondence every day. It informed him that his uncle, Josiah Thorne, had passed away at the age of 83, and that Elias was named as the sole beneficiary of his estate. The entire estate, as it turned out, consisted of $5 in cash and whatever personal effects remained in a rented room that had already been cleared by the landlord for unpaid rent. Elias had not seen his uncle in more than 40 years. He barely remembered the man, just a vague impression of someone quiet and disappointed, someone who had left the family ranch when Elias was still a boy and never returned. The family had spoken of Josiah rarely, and when they did, it was with the kind of dismissive sadness reserved for relatives who never quite measured up to expectations. A drifter, they called him. A man without roots or prospects. Looking at the letter now, Elias supposed he understood why his parents had spoken that way. $5. That was the sum total of a man's 83 years on this earth. It seemed like a particularly cruel joke, though Elias had learned long ago that life's sense of humor tended toward the bitter. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his shirt pocket, then finished his coffee in one long swallow. Outside, Redemption Springs was waking up to another day. He could hear the sounds filtering up through his floorboards, the stamp of horses in their stalls below, the murmur of early morning conversations, the rattle of wagon wheels on the main street. It was a sound he had known for 30 years, ever since he had drifted into this town himself, looking for work after his own family's ranch had been lost to drought and debt. 30 years. That was a long time to spend in one place, especially for a man who had once imagined himself living somewhere else, being someone else. But life had a way of taking those imagined futures and replacing them with something smaller, more manageable. He had worked as a ranch hand, a stable keeper, a freight hauler, whatever honest work presented itself. He had never married, never owned property, never built anything that would outlast him. At 67 years old, he was what people in town politely called a confirmed bachelor, and what they less politely called a permanent hired hand. The $5 sat on his table now, a crisp bill that seemed to mock him with its newness. The lawyer had included it with the letter, along with a note explaining that it represented the liquidation of Josiah Thorne's worldly possessions after debts and fees had been settled. Elias had stared at that bill for 3 days, trying to decide what to do with it. Part of him wanted to frame it, keep it as a memento of the uncle he had never really known. Another part wanted to burn it, reject this final insult from a family that had given him nothing but the Thorne name and a lifetime of modest expectations. But this morning he had decided to spend it, not on something practical, not on something he needed, but on something that would at least give him a story to tell. And in Redemption Springs, stories were a currency more valuable than cash. He dressed slowly, pulling on worn trousers and a shirt that had been mended more times than he could count, then his boots that knew the shape of his feet better than any living person knew the shape of his heart. He placed his hat on his head, a good hat still, despite its age, because a cowboy learned early that a good hat was worth the investment, and made his way down the narrow stairs to the street. Redemption Springs had been named by optimistic settlers who believed the land would redeem their past failures. It was a town of second chances, or so the story went, though Elias had observed that second chances usually looked remarkably similar to first chances, just with more worn edges and lower expectations. The main street ran straight through the heart of town, lined with the usual establishments, the general store, the hotel, the bank, the saloon, the church at the far end that seemed to keep a respectful distance from the saloon, as though sin and salvation needed separate territories. The morning sun was already warm, promising a hot afternoon. A few people nodded to him as he walked Martha Hayes, sweeping the boardwalk in front of her boarding house, old Samuel Reeves sitting in his usual chair outside the barber shop, young Tommy Chen hauling water buckets from the well. They were familiar faces, familiar routines, the comfortable repetition of a life lived in one place long enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. Which is why Elias knew, even before he reached the saloon, that word of his inheritance had already spread through town like wildfire through dry grass. The saloon belonged to a man named Frank Hutchins, who had owned it for as long as Elias had been in Redemption Springs. It was a respectable establishment, as saloons went mostly miners and ranch hands, a few traveling salesmen, the occasional gambler passing through. This early in the morning, it should have been nearly empty, just Frank wiping down the bar, and maybe one or two men nursing coffee and regrets from the night before. Instead, when Elias pushed through the doors, he found a dozen men gathered inside, all turning to look at him with expressions that ranged from amusement to outright glee. "Well, well," Frank said from behind the bar, a grin spreading across his weathered face. "If it isn't the richest man in Redemption Springs, how does it feel, Lucky, to be swimming in wealth?" They had started calling him Lucky 3 days ago, right after word got out about his inheritance. It was meant ironically, of course, because everyone in town knew that $5 was less than most of them earned in a week of honest work. The nickname had spread quickly, the way cruel jokes always did in small towns, where entertainment was scarce and other people's misfortunes provided the best amusement. Elias stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. He recognized most of the faces men he had worked alongside, drunk with, played cards with over the years. None of them were mean-spirited by nature, but men in groups had a way of becoming something other than what they were individually. They fed off each other's energy, competing to deliver the sharpest barb, the cleverest insult. "I hear your uncle left you his whole fortune," said Pete Morrison, a ranch foreman who usually treated Elias with decent respect. $5 whole. Must be nice to be set for life." Laughter rippled through the room. Another voice called out, "You gonna buy the saloon, Lucky? Or maybe the whole damn town?" "I heard he's saving up for a bath," someone else added. "Should be able to afford one by Christmas." More laughter. Elias stood there and let it wash over him, this moment of public humiliation that everyone had been anticipating for 3 days. He had known it was coming. In a place like Redemption Springs, any deviation from the ordinary became public property, and an inheritance of $5 was exactly the kind of thing that brought out the worst in people's humor. He could have walked out. He could have returned to his room and waited for the jokes to run their course, for some other piece of gossip to capture the town's attention. But something in him, some last spark of pride or stubbornness or plain old anger, made him walk forward instead. He moved through the room to the bar, his boots making solid sounds on the wooden floor, and placed the $5 bill on the scarred surface in front of Frank Hutchins. "I'll take a whiskey," he said quietly. Frank's grin faltered slightly. "Elias, I was just having some fun. You don't have to. A whiskey, Elias repeated, and keep the change. The laughter had died down now, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. $5 would buy several drinks with money left over, and everyone in the room knew it. Frank poured the whiskey with hands that were suddenly careful, precise, as though this simple transaction had become something more significant than it should have been. Elias lifted the glass, looked at the amber liquid for a long moment, then set it back down without drinking. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room, "I've changed my mind. I'll save this for later." He picked up the $5 bill, folded it carefully, and tucked it back into his shirt pocket. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the whiskey untouched on the bar and a room full of men who suddenly seemed unsure whether they should keep laughing or feel ashamed of themselves. Outside, the morning sun felt cleaner, brighter. Elias stood on the boardwalk for a moment, feeling the weight of the folded bill against his chest. $5. His uncle's entire life reduced to a sum that wouldn't buy a decent pair of boots. But maybe, Elias thought, it could buy something else. Something that would at least give him back a measure of dignity. He walked down the street toward the stagecoach office, his mind made up. If they wanted to laugh at Lucky Thorne and his $5 fortune, then by God he would give them something worth laughing about, or something worth remembering. The stagecoach office sat at the edge of town, where the main street gave way to the open road that connected Redemption Springs to the wider world. It was run by a man named Albert Griggs, who had held the position for 15 years and treated it with the bureaucratic seriousness of someone managing a government ministry rather than a way station for mail and freight. Elias found him sorting through a stack of letters, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose in that way that suggested they were always about to fall off, but never quite did. "Morning, Albert," Elias said. Albert looked up, his expression shifting through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, recognition, and then that particular kind of embarrassment people displayed when they realized they were face to face with someone who had recently become a source of town gossip. "Elias, what brings you by? I heard you've got some unclaimed freight, items that never got picked up." Albert's eyebrows rose slightly. "The dead letter pile? Well, yes, I suppose I do. Company policy says anything unclaimed for more than 6 months gets sold off or disposed of. Why do you ask?" "I'd like to take a look at what you've got." There was a moment of silence while Albert processed this request. Then understanding dawned on his face, followed by what looked like pity. "Elias, there's nothing worth having back there. Just old trunks and boxes that nobody wanted. Most of it's probably worthless. I'd still like to see it." Albert sighed and gestured toward a back room. "Suit yourself. It's all piled in there. But I'm telling you, you'd be better off spending your money on something practical." The back room was dim and musty, filled with the smell of old leather and dust. Crates and boxes were stacked against the walls, covered in the grime of years of neglect. There were 3 trunks pushed into one corner, each looking more battered than the last. Elias moved toward them, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust with each step. The first trunk was locked, its leather straps cracked and peeling. The second was partially open, revealing what looked like old blankets and clothing moth-eaten beyond any use. But the third trunk drew his attention. It was larger than the others, made of dark wood with brass fittings that had long since tarnished. Someone had carved initials into the top JM, in a careful, deliberate hand that suggested the owner had once taken pride in the piece. "How much for this one?" Elias called out. Albert appeared in the doorway. "That old thing, it's been here for 3 years at least, came in on a stage from Santa Fe, addressed to someone who died before it arrived. I've been meaning to break it up for firewood." He paused, then shrugged. "I'll take whatever you're offering." $4? Elias pulled out his $5 bill. "I'll give you 5 for it, and you help me carry it out front." "Elias, you're overpaying for—" $5, Elias repeated. "Do we have a deal?" Albert looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your money. Can't say I didn't warn you." Together, they hauled the trunk out of the back room and through the main office. It was heavier than it looked, solid wood that had been built to last. When they reached the front door, Elias paused. "Actually, Albert, let's set it down right here. Out in the street." "In the street? Why on earth would you—" But Elias was already pushing the trunk through the doorway, letting it thump down onto the dusty road. By now, a small crowd had started to gather. Word traveled fast in Redemption Springs, especially when Lucky Thorne was involved in something potentially entertaining. Pete Morrison was there, along with several of the men from the saloon. Martha Hayes had stopped her sweeping to watch. Even young Tommy Chen had abandoned his water buckets to see what was happening. Frank Hutchins stood in the doorway of his saloon, arms crossed, looking on with an expression Elias couldn't quite read. "What you got there, Lucky?" Pete called out. "Buried treasure?" Someone laughed. "More like Lucky's new house, $5 mansion." Elias ignored them. He knelt down beside the trunk, running his hands over the worn wood. The latches were stiff with age, but not locked. He worked them carefully, feeling the resistance of rust and time. Behind him, the crowd grew larger. He could hear whispers, speculation, the low buzz of people who sensed they were about to witness something worth talking about later. The first latch gave way with a metallic snap, then the second. Elias paused for just a moment, his hands resting on the lid, wondering if he was about to make an even bigger fool of himself than he already had. Then he lifted it open. The trunk exhaled a smell of old fabric and cedar, camphor and dust. Inside, just as Albert had predicted, there appeared to be nothing but clothing, old shirts and trousers, what looked like a woman's dress, all of it faded and moth-eaten. Someone in the crowd laughed. "Well, Lucky, at least you got yourself a new wardrobe," Pete said. "Those clothes only look about 40 years out of style." More laughter, but Elias was barely listening. He was pulling out the clothes, setting them aside on the dusty street, his hands moving with increasing speed. There had to be something else. There had to be a reason this trunk had called to him, why spending his entire inheritance on it had felt not like foolishness, but like necessity. His fingers hit the bottom of the trunk, solid wood, beneath the last layer of fabric. But something felt wrong. The depth didn't match. He knocked on the bottom, hearing a hollow sound that shouldn't have been there. The laughter had died away now. The crowd leaned in closer, curious despite themselves. Elias felt along the edges of the trunk's bottom, searching for a seam, a catch, anything that might indicate a hidden compartment. His fingers found a small indentation near one corner. He pressed it, heard a soft click, and the false bottom lifted away. The silence that followed was absolute. Beneath the false bottom lay a stack of papers, each one folded and sealed with what looked like official stamps. The top document bore an eagle seal and formal script that Elias recognized even before he read the words, United States Land Office. His hands shook as he lifted the first document, unfolding it carefully. The paper was thick, official, preserved in the sealed compartment far better than the clothing above it. He read the words once, then again, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. It was a land patent, a grant deed issued by the federal government in 1862, conveying ownership of Section 14, Township 12 North, Range 8 East to 1 Josiah Morrison. The legal description meant nothing to Elias at first, just a string of numbers and directions that surveyors used to carve up the territories. But then he saw the addendum, a handwritten note in the margin identifying the common name of the property, Redemption Valley. That was the old name for this area, before the town was built, before settlers had carved up the land into lots and parcels. Redemption Valley, the land the town sat on. With trembling hands, Elias lifted the second document. Another patent, same date, adjacent section, then a third, a fourth. He counted them as he went through the stack, 12 land patents in total, each one bearing the same date, each one signed by the land office registrar, each one conveying ownership of property in what was now Redemption Springs to Josiah Morrison. "What is it?" Someone in the crowd asked, their voice small and uncertain. Elias looked up, his face numb with shock. "Land patents," he said quietly. "Government grants from 1862. They're for the land this town is built on." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Albert Griggs pushed through to the front, his face pale. "That's impossible. This land has always been public domain. That's why the town was established here in the first place." "Then explain these," Elias said, holding up the stack of documents. Albert took them with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the pages. His expression shifted from skepticism to disbelief to something that looked like fear. "These appear to be genuine," he whispered. "But that would mean, Elias said, his voice growing stronger now, "that Josiah Morrison was the legal owner of this entire valley. And J.M., he pointed at the initials carved into the trunk's lid. Josiah Morrison. This was his trunk. "But who's Josiah Morrison?" Pete Morrison asked. Then his face went slack. "Wait. My name is Morrison. My family. My uncle's name was Josiah Thorne," Elias said slowly. "But people change their names. People drift away from their families and start over with new identities." He looked down at the patents in his hands, understanding dawning like a sunrise that had been hidden behind clouds for 40 years. "My uncle wasn't worthless. He was the original owner of this land, and he left it all to me." In the silence that followed, Elias heard nothing but the pounding of his own heart and the whisper of official documents rustling in the morning breeze. The $5 inheritance hadn't bought him a trunk full of old clothes. It had bought him the entire town. The crowd didn't disperse so much as fragment into smaller groups, each person gravitating toward others who shared their particular brand of disbelief. Some stood close to Elias, trying to get a better look at the documents he held. Others backed away as though the papers carried some contagious disease. A few simply walked off, shaking their heads as though they could dismiss what they had just witnessed through sheer force of denial. Elias remained kneeling beside the trunk, the land patents spread out before him on the dusty street. His mind felt strangely distant from his body, as though he were watching this scene unfold from somewhere far away. 12 patents, 12 sections of land. That was over 7,000 acres. If he was calculating correctly, an area large enough to encompass not just the town, but all the ranches and homesteads within 5 miles. "This has to be a forgery," someone said. Elias looked up to see Walter Brennan, the town's banker, pushing through the crowd. Brennan was a thin man with careful eyes who treated every transaction as though it might be the one that finally ruined him. "Land patents don't just appear out of nowhere after 60 years. They do if they've been hidden in a trunk for 60 years, Elias replied quietly. Brennan crouched down and picked up one of the documents, holding it up to the sunlight as though the truth of it might be revealed through closer inspection. "The paper looks old enough," he admitted, "and these seals appear genuine. But that doesn't prove anything. Anyone with the right materials could age paper and forge government stamps." "Why would anyone go to that trouble?" Martha Hayes asked. She had moved closer, her sweeping forgotten. What would be the point of forging documents and then letting them sit unclaimed in a trunk for years? "I don't know," Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "But the alternative is that this entire town has been built on private land without the owner's knowledge or permission. That's absurd." "Is it?" Elias asked. He was looking at Albert Griggs now. "Albert, you said this trunk came from Santa Fe 3 years ago, addressed to someone who died before it arrived. Who was it addressed to?" Albert's face had gone pale. "I'd have to check the records." "Check them." Albert disappeared back into his office, moving with the jerky urgency of a man who suddenly wanted to be anywhere but here. The crowd waited in uncomfortable silence, the morning sun climbing higher and bringing with it a heat that seemed to press down on them all. When Albert returned, he was carrying a ledger book, his finger marking a place on one of the pages. It was addressed to J. Thorne, he said quietly. "Care of General Delivery, Redemption Springs." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. My uncle sent this to himself, or tried to. He knew he was dying, maybe, and wanted to make sure these documents made it to family. But why hide them? Pete Morrison asked. If he owned the land, why not just file the papers properly? That was the question, Elias realized. That was the piece that didn't fit. A man who owned 7,000 acres of valuable land didn't live out his final years in a rented room, dying with only $5 to his name. Something had happened to Josiah Morrison or Josiah Thorne, or whoever his uncle had been in that final phase of his life that had forced him to hide his ownership and live in poverty. "We need to take these documents to a lawyer," Brennan said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone asserting control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Have them examined properly, determine their authenticity, and even if they are genuine, we'll need to establish whether they're still valid after all this time. There are statutes of limitation, adverse possession laws, all sorts of legal mechanisms that might override these old claims. Adverse possession requires open and notorious use for a certain period of years," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see Clara Hendricks, the schoolteacher, standing at the edge of the crowd. She was a woman in her 50s, with sharp intelligence and the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of teaching children who didn't always want to be taught. "I believe it's 7 years in this territory. If this land was truly private property, and the town has been using it without permission for longer than that, the patents might be worthless." "How long has Redemption Springs been here?" Elias asked. 32 years, Frank Hutchins said. He had moved closer, his earlier amusement completely gone. "The town was founded in 1856. I came here in 58 myself. 32 years. More than enough time for adverse possession to apply, if that was indeed the law." Elias felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. For a few minutes, he had owned an entire town. Now it seemed that ownership might be nothing more than a technicality, a legal curiosity with no actual power behind it. But then Clara Hendricks spoke again. "Of course, adverse possession only applies if the true owner didn't object to the use of their property. If they gave permission, even implicitly, the clock never starts." Everyone looked at Elias, waiting for him to say something, to claim something, to be something other than the aging cowboy they had known for 30 years. He gathered up the land patents carefully, stacking them back in the order he had found them. His hands had stopped shaking. His mind had cleared. Whatever happened next would require more than shock and confusion. "I'm going to Santa Fe," he said. "I'm going to find a lawyer who understands territorial land law, and I'm going to get these documents validated. Until then, everyone can go about their business as usual. I'm not going to start evicting people or demanding rent." He paused, looking around at the faces of his neighbors. "Though I might expect a little more respect than I've been getting lately." A few people had the grace to look ashamed. Pete Morrison cleared his throat. "Elias, about earlier, in the saloon." "It's forgotten," Elias said, though they both knew that wasn't quite true. Some things couldn't be forgotten, only set aside. "But I'll remember who stood by me now, and who didn't." "That seems fair." He picked up the trunk lighter now, without the documents, and began carrying it back toward the livery stable. Behind him, the crowd finally began to disperse, people drifting away in 2s and 3s, their conversations low and urgent. Elias knew what they would be talking about for the rest of the day, the rest of the week, possibly the rest of the year. The story of Lucky Thorne and his $5 fortune was just beginning. But as he climbed the stairs to his room above the stable, Elias found himself thinking not about what he had gained, but about what his uncle had lost. Somewhere between owning 7,000 acres and dying with $5, Josiah Morrison had made choices or faced circumstances that had cost him everything. Elias intended to find out what those circumstances were, and more importantly, he intended to make sure his uncle's sacrifice, whatever it had been, meant something in the end. The next morning, Elias woke to find a note slipped under his door. It was written on good paper in a careful hand, the kind of penmanship that spoke of education and deliberation. The message was brief. We should talk before you leave for Santa Fe. Come to the house after breakfast. Catherine Morrison. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, reading the note 3 times. Catherine Morrison was Pete Morrison's mother, a widow who lived in one of the larger houses on the eastern edge of town. She was well respected, known for her charity work and her sharp mind. Elias had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times in 30 years, always brief exchanges about weather or town events. He couldn't imagine why she wanted to see him now, though he suspected it had something to do with the shared last name she bore with his uncle. He dressed and made his way through town as the sun climbed over the eastern hills. The streets were quieter than usual, as though people were avoiding the main thoroughfare where yesterday's revelation had taken place. When he passed the saloon, Frank Hutchins was outside sweeping the boardwalk, and he gave Elias a nod that seemed almost respectful. Catherine Morrison's house sat behind a white picket fence that had been carefully maintained, the paint fresh and the gate hanging straight on its hinges. The garden was well tended, with flowers that showed the attention of someone who understood that beauty required patient work. Elias opened the gate and walked up the path, feeling oddly nervous, as though he were about to face some kind of judgment. Catherine opened the door before he could knock. She was a woman in her mid-60s, grey-haired and dignified, with eyes that missed very little. "Mr. Thorne, thank you for coming. Please, come inside." The interior of the house was modest but comfortable, furnished with pieces that had been chosen for quality rather than fashion. She led him to a small sitting room where tea had already been prepared, the cups set out on a tray with the kind of care that suggested this conversation mattered to her. "Please, sit," she said. "Would you care for tea?" "Thank you, ma'am." She poured for both of them, her movements precise and economical. When she finally sat down across from him, she studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "I knew Josiah Morrison," she said quietly. "He was my husband's uncle, which would make him my uncle by marriage, I suppose, though we never met. My husband passed away 15 years ago, and by then Josiah had already disappeared from the family's knowledge." Elias set down his teacup carefully. "I didn't know there were other Morrisons here. Pete never mentioned." "Pete doesn't know," Catherine interrupted. "My husband never spoke of his uncle. It was a source of shame in the family, you see. Some kind of betrayal that cut him off from everyone who shared his blood." She paused, looking down at her hands. "But I always wondered about that story. My husband was a good man, but he was also a man who believed family loyalty was absolute. He couldn't forgive his uncle for whatever had happened. Now I wonder if we were wrong about that." "What did happen?" Elias asked. "I don't know the details. My husband would never tell me, said it wasn't my burden to carry, but I know it had to do with land, this land, I suspect, or land nearby. There was some kind of dispute in the early days of the territory, before the town was established. Josiah claimed ownership of property that others believed should be public domain. He fought that claim in court, from what little I could gather, and lost, or appeared to lose. Elias thought about the land patents hidden in the trunk, the carefully preserved documents that proved Josiah's claim had been legitimate all along. "He didn't lose," Elias said. "He was the rightful owner. But somehow that got buried, hidden, forgotten." Catherine nodded slowly. "I suspected as much when I heard about the patents. It explains so much about the family's shame. They weren't ashamed because Josiah was wrong, but because they knew he was right, and they had turned their backs on him anyway." She looked up at Elias. "Pete doesn't know any of this. His grandfather never spoke of it, and I saw no reason to dig up old pain. But now that you've found those documents, the truth is going to come out, whether we like it or not." "I'm sorry," Elias said. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for your family." "You didn't cause anything," Catherine said firmly. "Josiah was wronged, and that wrong is finally coming to light. What matters now is what you intend to do about it. That's why I asked you here. I want to know your intentions before you go to Santa Fe." It was a fair question, and Elias found himself struggling to answer it. What were his intentions? Yesterday he had been Lucky Thorne, the town joke with a $5 inheritance. Today he was potentially the legal owner of thousands of acres and everything built upon them. The transformation was too vast to comprehend fully. "I want to know the truth," he said finally. "I want to understand what happened to my uncle, why he died in poverty when he owned all this land. And I want," he paused, trying to find the right words, "I want people to know he wasn't worthless, that he mattered." Catherine smiled, and it was a smile of approval. "That's a good answer. A better answer than I feared I might hear." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, which she set on the table between them. "This is $200. I want you to take it." Elias stared at the pouch. "Mrs. Morrison, I can't." "You can, and you will," she said. "You'll need money for the trip to Santa Fe, for a proper lawyer, for lodging while you're there. $200 won't make you rich, but it will give you a fighting chance to establish the truth of those patents." She pushed the pouch closer to him. "Consider it payment of an old debt. My husband's family wronged Josiah Morrison. Let this be the beginning of making that right." Elias picked up the pouch slowly, feeling the weight of the coins inside. "Why are you doing this? If I prove those patents are valid, it could affect property values here." "Your son's ranch." "My son has been a good steward of the land he works," Catherine said. "If that land rightfully belongs to you, then we'll find a way to make it right. But hiding from the truth serves no one. That's a lesson I learned from watching my husband carry shame that wasn't his to carry." She stood up, and Elias rose with her. "Go to Santa Fe, find your lawyer. Discover what happened to Josiah Morrison, and when you come back with the truth, whatever that truth might be." At the stagecoach office an hour later, Elias purchased his ticket with some of Catherine's money, feeling the weight of expectation and possibility pressing down on his shoulders. The stage would leave at dawn the next morning. He had the rest of the day to prepare, to say whatever goodbyes needed saying, to steel himself for what was coming. As he walked back toward his room, he noticed people watching him from doorways and windows, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to outright hostility. Lucky Thorne had become someone else overnight, and not everyone was happy about the transformation. He climbed the stairs to his room above the stable and spent the afternoon organizing the land patents, making notes about what he remembered from the trunk, preparing questions for whatever lawyer he might find in Santa Fe. The sun tracked across his small window, marking the passage of hours with methodical precision. Tomorrow he would begin the journey toward truth. Tonight he was still the man caught between two versions of himself, the cowboy everyone had known for 30 years, and the landowner nobody had expected him to become. In the space between those two identities, Elias Thorne sat and waited for dawn. The stage to Santa Fe left precisely at dawn, as promised, carrying Elias and 3 other passengers along a road that had been worn smooth by decades of travel. The other passengers were a merchant heading south with samples of his wares, a young woman traveling to visit family, and a circuit preacher who spent most of the journey reading from a worn Bible. They made polite conversation during the stops to change horses, but for the most part, they left Elias alone with his thoughts. He spent the journey watching the landscape change. The familiar hills around Redemption Springs, giving way to broader valleys, and then to the mountains that cradled Santa Fe. He had made this trip once before, years ago, when he was still young enough to believe that cities held opportunities that small towns could not provide. He had been disappointed then, finding Santa Fe just as constraining as anywhere else, just with more people and higher prices. Now he was returning with a different purpose, carrying documents that might rewrite not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in Redemption Springs. They arrived on the 3rd day. In the late afternoon, when the sun turned the adobe buildings the color of warm honey, Santa Fe was larger than Elias remembered, busier, with a restless energy that came from being a territorial capital where laws were made and unmade with alarming frequency. He found lodging at a modest boarding house near the plaza, paying for 3 nights in advance and hoping that would be enough time to accomplish what he needed. The next morning, armed with the name of a law firm that the merchant on the stage had recommended, Elias made his way through streets that still showed traces of Spanish colonial architecture mixed with newer American construction. The law office of Webb & Associates occupied the second floor of a building near the territorial courthouse, accessed by a narrow stairway that creaked with age. The reception area was small but well appointed, with a desk occupied by a clerk who looked up as Elias entered. "May I help you?" "I need to speak with a lawyer about some land patents," Elias said. "Territorial grants from 1862. The clerk's expression suggested this was not an unusual request. "Mr. Webb handles most of our land disputes. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm willing to wait." The clerk made a note in his ledger. "Please have a seat. Mr. Webb is with another client at the moment, but he should be available within the hour." Elias sat in one of the chairs against the wall and waited, his hands resting on his knees, the land patent secure in a leather folder he had purchased specifically for this trip. Other people came and went, a rancher arguing about water rights, a widow seeking to settle her late husband's estate, a businessman disputing a contract. Each time the inner office door opened, Elias caught glimpses of a man with silver hair and precise movements, always listening carefully to his clients, always making notes in a careful hand. When it was finally Elias's turn, Augustus Webb stood up from behind his desk and offered a handshake that was firm but not aggressive. He was older than Elias had expected, perhaps 70, with the kind of alert intelligence that suggested age had sharpened rather than dulled his faculties. "Mr. Thorne, is it? My clerk tells me you have questions about territorial land grants. Please, sit down and tell me what brings you to Santa Fe." Elias settled into the chair across from the desk and began to speak. He told the story simply, without embellishment, the inheritance, the $5, the trunk, the hidden patents. Webb listened without interruption, his fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. When Elias finished, he opened the leather folder and laid the 12 land patents on the desk. Webb picked up the first document with the careful reverence of someone who understood the value of old paper. He examined it closely, holding it up to the window to check the paper quality and watermarks, running his fingers over the seal as though feeling for authenticity. Then he did the same with the second document, and the third, working through the entire stack with methodical precision. The silence stretched long enough that Elias began to feel nervous. Finally, Webb set down the last patent and looked up. "These are genuine," he said quietly. "I've examined hundreds of territorial land patents, and these have all the correct markings. The paper stock is right for the period. The seals are genuine federal seals, and the signatures match what I would expect from the Land Office Registrar in 1862. He paused, his expression thoughtful. "But that creates a significant problem." "What kind of problem?" "These patents grant ownership of land in what's now Bernalillo County, in an area that was designated as public domain when the territory was surveyed in the 1852. If these patents are valid, and I believe they are, then that designation was in error. Someone at the land office made a grant of private property that shouldn't have been made. Or more accurately, the land office properly granted the land to Josiah Morrison, and then someone else later incorrectly classified it as public domain." Elias felt his chest tighten. "What does that mean for the people living there now?" Webb leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the desk. "It means we have a legal complication of the highest order. If the land was legally granted to Morrison in 1862 and he never sold it or transferred title, then technically every structure built on that land since then, every fence line drawn, every deed recorded, every transaction completed, all of it was done without proper authority." "But people have been living there for 30 years, Elias protested. "They've built homes, businesses, entire lives. You're saying all of that is invalid?" "Not necessarily invalid, but potentially subject to challenge. There's a legal doctrine called adverse possession that might protect some of those interests, but it's complicated. The requirements vary depending on whether the possession was in good faith or bad faith, whether the true owner was aware of the occupation, whether taxes were paid. Webb held up a hand. It's a legal morass, Mr. Thorne, and navigating it will require careful work. Elias sat back in his chair, feeling overwhelmed. What would you advise? First, we need to conduct a thorough title search to trace the chain of ownership from Morrison to you. That means verifying that Morrison never sold or transferred the land during his lifetime and confirming that you are indeed his legal heir. Webb pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began making notes. Second, we need to research the history of how this land came to be classified as public domain. There may be government records that explain what happened. Third, we need to consider your objectives. Do you want to claim full ownership and potentially dispossess everyone currently living on the land, or do you want to find a more equitable solution? I don't want to dispossess anyone, Elias said immediately. I just want the truth to come out. I want people to know my uncle wasn't worthless. Webb nodded slowly. A noble goal, but truth and justice don't always align as neatly as we'd like. Once this information becomes public, there will be consequences you cannot control. People who have mortgages on property they thought they owned will face uncertainty. Businesses built on what they believed was purchased land will question their legal standing. The territorial government may become involved, trying to protect what they've classified as public domain. Are you saying I should just let it go? Pretend I never found these patents? No, Webb said firmly. I'm saying you need to understand what you're beginning before you take the first step. This will not be simple. It will not be quick, and it will make you enemies among people who currently consider themselves friends. But if you're determined to see this through, I'll help you. It's been a long time since I had a case that mattered this much. Elias thought about Catherine Morrison giving him $200 to seek the truth. He thought about his uncle dying in poverty, his rightful property stolen or hidden or simply forgotten. He thought about standing in that saloon while men laughed at his $5 inheritance. I'm determined, he said. Webb smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had just accepted a challenge worth accepting. Then, let's begin. The territorial archives occupied a stone building that smelled of old paper and dust, maintained by a librarian who seemed to have grown into his position over decades of careful service. Augustus Webb knew him by name. They had worked together on enough cases that formality had given way to professional friendship, and within an hour of arriving, they had been granted access to court records going back to the territory's earliest days. Elias sat at a long wooden table, surrounded by ledger books and file boxes, while Webb worked through the material with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading legal documents. The morning sun streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Here, Webb said suddenly, his finger marking a place in a ledger dated 1863. Morrison versus the Territory of New Mexico, a land dispute case filed in January of that year. Elias leaned closer. The entry was brief, written in a clerk's careful hand. Plaintiff Josiah Morrison claims legal ownership of property in Redemption Valley per federal land grant. Territory argues grants were issued in error, property properly classified as public domain. Case dismissed. Plaintiff liable for court costs. Dismissed, Elias said. Just like that? Webb was already pulling another file box toward him. There should be more detail somewhere. Court cases generate documentation, pleadings, motions, testimony transcripts. If this was a significant dispute, there will be a record of the arguments made. They worked through the morning, piecing together fragments of the case. What emerged was a picture of systematic injustice that made Elias's chest tight with anger. Josiah Morrison had arrived in the territory in early 1862, carrying his land patents and intending to establish a ranch in the valley that would later become Redemption Springs. But when he tried to record his patents at the land office, he was told they were invalid, that the land had already been reclassified as public domain through a territorial survey conducted the previous year. Morrison had protested, arguing that federal land patents superseded territorial classifications, that the United States government had granted him the land, and no territorial authority could override that grant. The land office refused to hear his argument, so Morrison filed suit in territorial court. The trial lasted only 2 days. The territory was represented by a man named Howard Stark, who Webb explained had been a powerful territorial official with connections to mining interests and railroad companies. Morrison represented himself, lacking the money to hire proper counsel. The transcript makes for difficult reading, Webb said, passing several yellowed pages to Elias. Morrison presented his patents, explained the federal law governing land grants, argued his case clearly and reasonably. But Stark didn't argue law. He argued politics. Elias read through the transcript, his hands shaking slightly as he absorbed the words. Stark had painted Morrison as an outsider, trying to steal land from honest settlers. He had suggested without evidence that Morrison's patents might be forgeries. He had implied that Morrison was working with Confederate sympathizers to undermine territorial development. This last accusation was particularly damaging, as 1863 was the height of the Civil War, and any hint of Confederate sympathy could destroy a man's reputation. The judge had ruled in the territory's favor, dismissing Morrison's case and ordering him to pay court costs that exceeded $200 more money than most men earned in a year. The ruling specifically noted that Morrison's federal land patents were of questionable validity and insufficient to override established territorial survey classifications. "This is wrong," Elias said quietly. "The judge had to know federal law superseded territorial classifications. That's basic constitutional principle." "Of course he knew," Webb replied, "but understanding the law and applying it justly are not always the same thing. My research into Judge Harlan, that's who presided over the case, shows he had financial interests in several businesses that were already operating in Redemption Valley. If he ruled in Morrison's favor, those businesses would suddenly be operating on private land without the owner's permission. He had personal reasons to rule against Morrison, regardless of what the law actually said." "So they stole the land," Elias said. "They used the court system to legitimize theft." Webb nodded slowly. "That's exactly what they did, and Morrison, lacking resources to appeal and facing social ostracism due to Stark's accusations, did what many men in his position did. He disappeared. Changed his name back to Thorne, moved around the territory, tried to rebuild a life from nothing. He gestured to the documents spread across the table, but he never stopped believing those patents were valid. That's why he kept them, why he tried to send them back to family before he died. He wanted someone to know the truth." Elias stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Santa Fe's busy streets without really seeing them. He thought about his uncle spending 40 years in poverty, knowing he rightfully owned thousands of acres but unable to claim them. He thought about the shame that must have accompanied every day, every moment of need, knowing that wealth was rightfully his but had been stolen through legal manipulation. "What happened to the others?" he asked. "Stark, the judge, the businesses that benefited from this theft?" Webb consulted his notes. Judge Harlan died in 1871, still on the bench. Howard Stark made a fortune in mining speculation and railroad development. He died wealthy and respected in 1880. As for the businesses, most of them are still operating in Redemption Springs, owned now by the children and grandchildren of the original operators. He paused. "The past doesn't always deliver justice, Mr. Thorne. Sometimes it just delivers consequences to people who had nothing to do with the original wrong. But those consequences are based on stolen property," Elias said. "If I don't challenge this, then Morrison's theft becomes permanent. The lie becomes truth simply because enough time has passed." "That's one way to look at it," Webb agreed. Another way is to say that two wrongs don't make a right. Morrison was wronged, grievously and deliberately. But the people living in Redemption Springs today didn't commit that wrong. They're innocent parties who built their lives on what they believed to be legal foundations. Elias turned back from the window. So what do you advise? I advise that we document everything we found. We establish the historical record that Morrison's patents were valid, that the territorial court ruling was unjust, that your uncle was systematically robbed of his property through legal corruption. Webb closed the ledger book in front of him. But then, I advise you to think carefully about what happens next. You have several options. You could file suit to reclaim the land, forcing everyone in Redemption Springs to defend their property rights. You could demand compensation from the territorial government for the theft of your inheritance. You could negotiate private settlements with current landowners, allowing them to purchase clear title from you. Or you could simply record the truth and let history judge, without demanding any material compensation. Which would you choose? Elias asked. Webb smiled slightly. I'm a lawyer, Mr. Thorne. I don't make those decisions for my clients. I present options and let them choose their own path. He gathered up the documents they had been reviewing. But if you're asking my personal opinion, I'd say the answer depends on what you're really seeking. If you want money, there are paths to that. If you want revenge against people long dead, you can pursue that. But if you want what you told me when we first met, if you want people to know your uncle wasn't worthless, that he mattered, then maybe the answer is different. Elias thought about Catherine Morrison, giving him $200 to seek the truth. He thought about the people in Redemption Springs, some of whom had mocked him and some of whom had shown him kindness. He thought about what justice might look like when it came 60 years too late. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Take all the time you need, Webb replied. But remember that once we file any legal action, once this information becomes public record, you won't be able to control what happens next. The decision you make now will shape not just your life, but the lives of everyone in Redemption Springs. They left the archives as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Santa Fe's plaza. Elias carried copies of the documents Webb had made, evidence of injustice that had been buried for decades. The weight of that evidence felt heavier than the papers themselves, as though history itself was pressing down on his shoulders, demanding acknowledgement, demanding action, demanding something he wasn't yet sure he could give. Elias spent the night at his boarding house, unable to sleep, his mind turning over everything Webb had told him. By dawn, he had made his decision. He would return to Redemption Springs, call a town meeting, and present the truth about the land patents without demanding anything in return. Let the historical record be corrected. Let his uncle's name be cleared. That would be enough. He rose early and went to settle his account with the boarding house, intending to catch the morning stage back home. But when he arrived at the stage office, he found Augustus Webb already there, waiting for him with an expression that suggested something significant had happened. Mr. Thorne, I'm glad I caught you before you left. Webb was holding a folder thick with papers. I couldn't stop thinking about the case last night, so I went back to the archives first thing this morning. There was something that bothered me about the court records, a reference that didn't quite make sense. I wanted to check it before you left. What did you find? Webb opened the folder, pulling out a document that looked like a shipping manifest. This is from the Santa Fe Freight Company, dated 3 years ago. It shows 2 trunks shipped to Redemption Springs, both addressed to J. Thorne, both sent on the same day. But you only received 1 trunk. Elias felt his stomach drop. 2 trunks? According to this manifest, yes. Both were delivered to the Redemption Springs stage office on the same date. Webb pulled out another document. But this is the receipt log from your local office, the one I had my clerk request by telegraph yesterday. It shows only 1 trunk received. The 2nd trunk was never logged as delivered. Where did it go? That's what I spent the morning finding out. Webb's expression was grim. I spoke with the freight company manager. He checked their records and found something interesting. The second trunk was diverted here in Santa Fe before it reached the final stage. It's been sitting in their unclaimed freight warehouse for 3 years. Elias's hands had started shaking again. Why would it be diverted? The manager couldn't tell me that. But he did tell me that access to the warehouse requires authorization, and there's a log of everyone who's entered in the past 3 years. Someone accessed the section where your uncle's trunk was stored, but they didn't remove it. Webb paused, choosing his words carefully. They just wanted to see what was inside. Who was it? The signature is illegible, but the date is clear. 2 months after the trunk was diverted, someone came to examine it. That same week, I checked the court records again, and I found that the Territorial Attorney's Office filed a motion to seal all documents related to Morrison versus Territory. The motion was granted. The implications of this struck Elias like a physical blow. Someone had known about the second trunk, had examined its contents, and had then moved to keep the original court case sealed and hidden. What's in the second trunk? I don't know, Webb said. But the freight company has agreed to release it to you, since you're the intended recipient. They're bringing it to my office within the hour. They walked back to Webb's office in silence. Elias's mind was racing, trying to understand what this meant. If the second trunk contained only personal effects like the first one, why would anyone care enough to examine it and then work to seal the court records? There had to be something more, something that someone wanted to keep hidden. The trunk arrived on a freight wagon, carried up the narrow stairs by 2 workers who deposited it in Webb's office and left without ceremony. It was similar in size and construction to the first trunk, but this one bore different initials carved into the lid. J.T. for Josiah Thorne, the name his uncle had used in his final years. Webb produced a crowbar and handed it to Elias. Whatever's inside, we need to document it carefully. This may be evidence in a legal proceeding. Elias pried open the latches, which gave way more easily than those on the first trunk. When he lifted the lid, he found himself staring not at clothing or personal effects, but at neat stacks of leather-bound journals, each one labeled with dates spanning from 1862 to 1885. Diaries, Webb breathed. Your uncle kept diaries. Elias lifted the first journal out carefully, opening it to a random page. The handwriting was precise and deliberate, the words of a man who had wanted to leave a complete record of his life. He began to read aloud. The 12th of March, 1863. The trial has concluded as I feared it would. Judge Harlan ruled against me, and in doing so has legitimized the theft of my property. But I am not without recourse. I have spent these past weeks documenting every interaction, every conversation, every piece of evidence that demonstrates the corruption at the heart of this case. Stark approached me 3 times before the trial, offering to settle if I would sell him the mineral rights to the northern sections of my land. When I refused, he threatened to destroy my reputation. He has made good on that threat. Elias looked up at Webb, whose face had gone pale. He documented everything. They spent the next hour going through the journals, Webb taking notes while Elias read passages aloud. What emerged was a meticulous chronicle of corruption that went far beyond a simple land dispute. Josiah Morrison had documented conversations in which Howard Stark openly discussed bribing judges, intimidating witnesses, and manipulating territorial surveys to benefit his mining interests. He had recorded the names of officials who took payments, businesses that participated in the conspiracy, and court decisions that were predetermined before trials even began. But more than that, the journals showed something else. Morrison's descent from confident landowner to desperate fugitive. The later entries detailed his decision to change his name, his attempts to rebuild his life in different parts of the territory, his growing recognition that fighting the system was impossible when the system itself was corrupt. The final journal, dated just months before Morrison's death, contained an entry that made Elias's throat tight. I have failed to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but perhaps I can ensure that the truth survives me. I am sending 2 trunks to Redemption Springs, addressed to the Thorne family, in the hope that some relative will eventually claim them. The first contains my land patents, proof of my legal ownership. The second contains these journals, proof of the corruption that stole that ownership from me. Together, they tell a complete story. If anyone in my family has the courage to pursue this, they will have everything they need to expose what happened. I ask only that my name be cleared, that people know I was not the failure they believed me to be. Webb sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. These journals aren't just family history, Mr. Thorne. They're evidence of criminal conspiracy. If even half of what Morrison documented here is accurate, it implicates multiple territorial officials in systematic corruption. But those officials are all dead now, Elias said. What good does exposing them do? Dead officials, yes, but living institutions. The territorial government that benefited from this corruption is still operating. The businesses that were built on stolen land are still thriving. And more importantly, the legal precedent set by Morrison's case, the principle that federal land grants can be overridden by corrupt territorial classifications, that precedent is still being used. Webb tapped the journals. These documents don't just vindicate your uncle, they potentially invalidate dozens or hundreds of land transactions across the territory. Elias felt the weight of this revelation settle over him. He had thought he was dealing with a simple matter of inheritance, a personal story of one man wronged. Now he understood he was holding evidence of something much larger, something that threatened the foundations of territorial land law itself. "What do I do with this?" he asked quietly. Webb was silent for a long moment. "That depends on what kind of man you want to be. You could use these journals to file a massive lawsuit against the territory, seeking compensation not just for your uncle's stolen land, but for the broader pattern of corruption. You could take the information to territorial newspapers, create a scandal that would shake the government. You could negotiate with officials, trading your silence for compensation. Or you could consider what your uncle actually wanted. He didn't send these journals to create chaos or seek revenge. He sent them to clear his name, to ensure that one person, someone in his family, knew the truth about what happened to him." Webb closed the journal he had been examining. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do with truth is simply to acknowledge it, to bear witness to injustice, without demanding that the entire world reshape itself around our grievance. Elias looked down at the journals, at his uncle's careful handwriting, documenting years of struggle and disappointment. He thought about the people in Redemption Springs, going about their lives, unaware that their town was built on stolen land and corrupt court rulings. He thought about what justice might mean when the people who committed the crimes were all dead and the people who would pay the price were all innocent. "I need to go home," he said finally. "I need to think about this, where I can see the land we're talking about, where I can remember that these aren't just legal abstractions, but actual places where real people live." Webb nodded. "A wise decision. Take the journals with you, study them, and when you're ready to decide what to do, come back to Santa Fe. I'll be here." Elias carefully packed the journals back into the trunk, securing the lid. As he did, he noticed something else at the bottom, a sealed envelope with his name written on it in his uncle's hand. He opened it and found a brief letter. "To whoever finds these journals, the land and the truth both belong to you now. What you do with them will define not just my legacy but yours. Choose wisely and choose with kindness. The world has enough anger. What it needs is justice tempered by mercy. J.M." Elias folded the letter and placed it in his pocket next to the $5 bill that had started this entire journey. 2 inheritances from one uncle, land and wisdom, wealth and responsibility, the past and the future, all tangled together in ways he was only beginning to understand. The stage back to Redemption Springs felt longer than the journey to Santa Fe, though Elias knew the distance was the same. He sat with the second trunk secured beside him, filled with journals that contained enough explosive information to reshape territorial politics. The other passengers gave him curious looks, but didn't ask questions, perhaps sensing that whatever burden he carried was too heavy for casual conversation. He arrived in Redemption Springs on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was settling behind the western hills. The town looked the same as when he had left, same buildings, same dusty streets, same people going about their familiar routines. But Elias saw it differently now. Every structure, every fence post, every planted tree stood on land that had been stolen through legal manipulation. The entire town was built on a foundation of injustice. He arranged for the trunk to be delivered to his room above the livery stable, then walked through town toward Catherine Morrison's house. She answered his knock almost immediately, as though she had been waiting for his return. "Mr. Thorne, you're back sooner than I expected." "I found more than I went looking for," Elias said. "May I come in? I need your counsel." They sat in her parlor while Elias told her everything: the corrupt trial, the sealed court records, the second trunk filled with journals documenting systematic corruption. Catherine listened without interrupting, her face growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. Finally she spoke. "What do you intend to do?" "That's what I don't know," Elias admitted. "My uncle wanted his name cleared." "That seems simple enough. But these journals contain information that goes far beyond one man's stolen property. If I make them public, it could affect land titles across the entire territory." "But would that be wrong?" Catherine asked. "If titles are based on corrupt proceedings, don't people deserve to know that?" "Deserve to know? Yes, but deserve to suffer for it. The people who committed these crimes are all dead. The people who would pay the price are innocent people like your son, who's worked that ranch his whole life, believing it was rightfully his." Catherine's expression softened. "You're a good man, Elias Thorne. A lesser person would use this information for personal gain without considering the cost to others." She paused, then added, "But let me ask you something. If you stay silent, if you hide what you've learned, what happens to the truth? Does corruption become legitimate simply because enough time has passed?" Webb asked me the same question, in different words. "Because it's the right question. Truth matters, Elias, not just for your uncle's sake, but for all of us. If we can't trust that our institutions are honest, if we accept that corruption is acceptable as long as it happened in the past, then we're building our future on the same rotten foundation that destroyed your uncle." She leaned forward. "I'm not saying you should seek revenge or demand compensation, but I am saying that people deserve to know the truth about how this town was founded. What they do with that truth is their choice to make." Elias spent that night reading through his uncle's journals by lamplight, following the trajectory of a life that had started with hope and ended in quiet desperation. Josiah Morrison had been an educated man, articulate and principled, someone who believed the legal system would protect his rights. The journals showed that belief eroding year by year as he confronted the reality that justice was not blind, but rather quite selective about what it chose to see. But the journals also showed something else. They showed a man who never lost his fundamental decency, even in entries written when Morrison was at his lowest point. When he was living in poverty and isolation, he never expressed hatred toward the people of Redemption Springs. He blamed the corrupt officials who had stolen from him, but he didn't blame the ordinary settlers who had built lives on land they believed was rightfully available to them. It was that grace, that ability to distinguish between systemic corruption and individual innocence, that finally showed Elias what he needed to do. He spent the next morning making arrangements. He spoke with Frank Hutchins about using the saloon for a town meeting. He asked Martha Hayes to spread word that everyone was invited to attend. He stopped by the church and requested that Reverend Thomas ring the bell, the one that usually called people to Sunday services, to gather the town at 7 o'clock that evening. "What's this about, Elias?" the Reverend asked. "It's about truth," Elias replied. and about giving people information they deserve to have. Word spread quickly through Redemption Springs. By mid-afternoon, it seemed everyone knew that Lucky Thorne was calling a town meeting to discuss his inheritance. Speculation ran wild. He was going to demand rent from everyone. He was going to sell the land to outside investors. He was going to sue the territorial government. Elias heard the rumors as he walked through town, but didn't confirm or deny any of them. At 6:30, he carried both trunks to the saloon. Frank had arranged chairs and benches to accommodate as many people as possible, and the room was already filling up. Elias set the trunks at the front of the room and took a seat to wait. Catherine Morrison arrived early and took a seat near the front. Pete Morrison came in shortly after, looking uncomfortable but determined to hear what would be said. Albert Griggs from the stage office, Martha Hayes, young Tommy Chen and his parents, Walter Brennan the banker, they all filed in, along with ranch hands and miners, storekeepers and craftsmen, families and individuals, until the saloon was packed with what must have been half the adult population of Redemption Springs. At 7 o'clock exactly, the church bell began to ring. The sound carried across the valley, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo off the surrounding hills. People who hadn't yet arrived began hurrying toward the saloon, not wanting to miss whatever was about to happen. When the bell finally fell silent, Elias stood up. The room quieted immediately, all eyes turning toward him. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you all for coming. I know there's been a lot of talk about what I found in Santa Fe, a lot of speculation about what I plan to do with the information I discovered. I want to start by telling you exactly what happened, without rumor or exaggeration." He told the story chronologically, starting with the $5 inheritance and ending with the discovery of the second trunk. He spoke plainly, without drama, letting the facts carry their own weight. When he described the corrupt trial and the theft of his uncle's property, angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. When he mentioned the journals and their documentation of territorial corruption, people leaned forward, hungry for details. "I've spent the past few days trying to decide what to do with this information," Elias continued. "I could file lawsuits. I could demand compensation. I could use these journals to create a scandal that would shake the territorial government. Augustus Webb, the lawyer who helped me research this, laid out all of those options." He paused, looking around the room at faces he had known for 3 decades. These were his neighbors, his community, people who had laughed at him and with him, who had given him work and friendship and occasionally grief. But those options all seemed to miss what my uncle actually wanted. He didn't send these trunks back here seeking revenge or wealth. He sent them seeking something simpler: recognition that he had been wronged, acknowledgement that he wasn't the failure people believed him to be. Elias opened the first trunk and pulled out the land patents. "These documents prove my uncle was the legal owner of this land. They prove the territorial government acted corruptly when they stripped him of that ownership. They prove every deed, every title, every property transaction in Redemption Springs for the past 30 years was built on stolen land." The room erupted in shocked conversation. Elias waited for it to quiet down before continuing. "But my uncle also sent this." He opened the second trunk and gestured to the journals inside. 60 years of documentation showing exactly how and why he was robbed. Not just accusations, but detailed evidence of corruption that went far beyond one man's stolen property. "What are you going to do with all this?" someone called out from the back of the room. Elias looked toward the voice, but couldn't identify the speaker. "That's what I want to talk to you about, because this isn't just my decision to make. This is about all of us. This town, this community. What happens next affects everyone here, and I think you deserve to have a say in it." He pulled out a chair and sat down, the land patents and journals spread out on the table beside him. "So, I'm going to tell you what I'm considering, and I want to hear what you think. Not just from the people who own property or run businesses, but from everyone, because whatever choice I make, we all have to live with it together." The room fell silent, everyone waiting to hear what Elias would say next. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red, the kind of sunset that people in Redemption Springs had watched for 30 years without ever knowing they were watching it from stolen land. Elias took a breath and began to explain the options Augustus Webb had presented to him, laying out each possibility with its potential consequences. As he spoke, he watched faces in the crowd shift from anger to fear to something that looked almost like hope, the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't require choosing between justice and mercy, between truth and peace, between honoring the past and building a future. And as the last light faded from the sky, Lucky Thorne, who was no longer just lucky but something more complicated, something more real, waited to hear what his neighbors would say. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then Walter Brennan stood up, his banker's face drawn with worry. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said. "You're telling us that every mortgage I've issued, every loan I've secured with land as collateral, might be legally invalid." "That's one interpretation," Elias replied carefully. "Though Augustus Webb believes there are legal doctrines that could protect existing transactions if we handle this properly." "If we handle it properly," Brennan's voice rose slightly. "Elias, with all due respect, this isn't something that can be handled properly. This is a disaster waiting to happen. If word gets out about these patents and journals, property values will collapse, banks will call in loans, people will lose their homes. Or," Catherine Morrison said, standing up from her seat near the front, "we could face the truth honestly and find a solution together, rather than hiding corruption and hoping it stays buried." "Easy for you to say," someone called out. "Your son's ranch has been in your family for 20 years. You've got equity built up. What about people like me who just bought their property last year? I'll lose everything." "Nobody's trying to make you lose anything," Elias said, his voice firm but not angry. "That's why I'm here talking to you instead of filing lawsuits. I want to find a solution that honors my uncle's memory without destroying people's lives." Pete Morrison stood up, his expression conflicted. "My mother told me this morning that Josiah Morrison was my great-uncle. I had no idea. My grandfather never mentioned him, never spoke about what happened." He looked at Elias. "I've been thinking about this all day, and I keep coming back to one question. What would satisfy you? What would make you feel like justice has been done?" It was the right question, and Elias appreciated Pete for asking it directly. "I want my uncle's name cleared. I want it known that he wasn't a failure or a charlatan, that he was wronged by a corrupt system. Beyond that," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "beyond that, I want this town to be built on honesty going forward, even if its past was built on theft." "That's noble," said a rancher named Jim Crawford, "but it's also vague. What does honesty look like in practice? Do we tear up our deeds and start over?" "I don't know yet," Elias admitted. "That's why I'm asking for input." Augustus Webb suggested several possibilities. "One option is that I could deed the land to the town collectively, essentially making Redemption Springs a community trust where everyone has equal ownership. Another option is that I could sell clear title to current landowners at nominal prices, just enough to make the transactions legal. A third option is that I could pursue legal action to get compensation from the territorial government rather than from individuals." Martha Hayes raised her hand like a schoolchild waiting to be called on. When Elias nodded to her, she stood up. "I've lived in Redemption Springs for 18 years. I've run my boarding house, paid my taxes, contributed to this community. And now you're telling me I might not own my own home?" Her voice wavered slightly. "I'm sorry your uncle was wronged, Elias. I truly am. But I don't see how punishing people who had nothing to do with that wrong makes anything right." "I agree with you," Elias said, "and I'm not trying to punish anyone. But I can't pretend this information doesn't exist. I can't ignore what happened to my uncle just because acknowledging it causes inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" someone shouted. "You call losing our homes an inconvenience?" The room erupted in competing voices, people shouting to be heard, arguments overlapping, until Frank Hutchins stood up behind the bar and rang the bell he usually used to call last rounds. "Quiet! Everyone quiet down!" He waited until the noise subsided. "This isn't helping anything. Elias came here in good faith to talk about this. The least we can do is have a civil conversation." Reverend Thomas stood up from where he had been sitting quietly near the back. "Perhaps," he said in his measured preacher's voice, "we should consider this from a different angle. Elias has presented us with truth, uncomfortable truth, but truth nonetheless. The question isn't whether we like this truth or whether it's convenient. The question is what kind of community we want to be when faced with it. We want to be a community that doesn't lose everything we've worked for," Jim Crawford said bluntly. "And I want to be part of a community that doesn't ask me to bury truth for the sake of comfort," Catherine Morrison countered. The debate continued, voices rising and falling, arguments circling around questions of justice and practicality, honor and survival. Elias sat and listened, watching his neighbors wrestle with the same questions he had been wrestling with for days. Some people were angry, some were frightened, some were genuinely trying to find a path forward that would satisfy everyone. As the evening wore on, something began to shift in the room. The initial panic and anger started giving way to something more thoughtful. People who had been shouting began listening. Questions became less accusatory and more genuinely curious. Someone suggested forming a committee to work with Elias and his lawyer to explore options. Someone else proposed taking up a collection to help fund legal fees, spreading the cost across the community rather than leaving Elias to bear it alone. Young Tommy Chen, who had been sitting quietly with his parents, raised his hand. When Frank nodded to him, he stood up nervously. "Mr. Thorne, if you wanted to hurt us, you could have just filed lawsuits without telling us anything. You came here and told us the truth and asked what we thought. That means something." Several people nodded in agreement. Pete Morrison cleared his throat. "Tommy's right." Elias could have approached this very differently. The fact that he's here, trying to find a solution that works for everyone, tells us what kind of man he is. Elias felt something in his chest loosen slightly, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. This was what community meant. Not agreement, not ease, but the willingness to face hard truths together and try to find a way through them that preserved everyone's dignity. Walter Brennan stood up again, but this time his expression was different, thoughtful rather than panicked. "I've been sitting here thinking about what Pete and Tommy said, and they're right. Elias has been more than fair in how he's approached this, so let me make a proposal." The room quieted, everyone turning to listen to the banker. "What if we approach this as a community investment?" Brennan continued. "Elias owns the land legally, but we've all built our lives here. Instead of fighting over who's right and who's wrong, what if we create a trust, a legal entity that holds the land for the benefit of everyone? Current property owners would pay a one-time fee to the trust, much less than what their properties are worth, but enough to compensate Elias fairly. That money could be used to build things the whole community needs: a proper school, a medical clinic, infrastructure improvements. And the trust would ensure that future development happens in a way that benefits everyone, not just whoever has the most money or connections." Clara Hendricks, the schoolteacher, stood up eagerly. "A proper school building," she said. "We've been making do with the church basement for years. The children deserve better." "And a doctor," Martha Hayes added. "The nearest physician is 15 miles away. If someone gets seriously hurt or ill—" "Exactly," Brennan said. "We take this difficult situation and transform it into an opportunity to build something better than what we had before. Something that honors both Josiah Morrison's rightful ownership and the work everyone here has put into building this town." Elias felt something stirring in his chest, not just relief, but recognition. This was what his uncle's final letter had meant by justice tempered by mercy. Not vengeance against people who were already gone, Not punishment for people who were innocent, but transformation of an old wrong into a new right. I like this idea, he said slowly, but I want to add something to it. Whatever fees people pay to the trust, they should be proportional to their ability to pay. Someone like Walter, who runs a bank, can afford more than someone like Martha, who runs a boarding house. And anyone who truly can't afford to pay widows, people on hard times, families just starting out, they shouldn't be forced to lose their homes over this. Pete Morrison nodded. That's fair. And I'll be the first to say that my family should pay more than most. We've done well from this land, even if we didn't know it was technically stolen. We can afford to make a substantial contribution to the trust. One by one, others began to stand and voice their support. Some added suggestions, refinements to the basic proposal. Someone proposed that the trust be governed by an elected board, ensuring democratic oversight. Someone else suggested that a portion of trust funds be set aside specifically to document and preserve the true history of how Redemption Springs was founded, including the full story of Josiah Morrison's treatment. Not everyone agreed. A few people remained skeptical, worried about the details, concerned about potential problems, but even they seemed willing to work within this framework rather than fight against it. As the meeting stretched into the late evening, Frank brought out coffee, and the atmosphere shifted from confrontational to collaborative. People who had been shouting at each other an hour earlier were now working together to solve problems. Catherine Morrison took notes on a large ledger, documenting proposals and commitments, creating a record of what was being born here tonight. Finally, as midnight approached, Reverend Thomas stood up and raised his hands for attention. I think we've accomplished something remarkable here tonight. We've faced an uncomfortable truth and found a path forward that honors both justice and community. But this is just the beginning. Elias will need to work with Augustus Webb to make sure everything we've discussed tonight is legally sound. We'll need to establish the trust, set up governance, determine fair payment schedules. This will take months, maybe years, to fully implement. I understand that, Elias said, and I'm committed to seeing it through the right way, even if it takes time. Walter Brennan pulled out a blank ledger from his satchel. Then, let's start right now. I propose we create a formal record of tonight's meeting, who was here, what was proposed, what was agreed to. This becomes our founding document, our commitment to each other and to doing this right. For the next hour, people lined up to sign the ledger, adding their names to what was essentially a new social contract for Redemption Springs. As each person signed, Elias shook their hand, accepting their commitment and offering his own. When Catherine Morrison stepped up to sign, she paused and looked at Elias. Your uncle would be proud of you, she said quietly. You took his pain and turned it into something that lifts everyone up. That's the best kind of justice there is. Pete Morrison was the last to sign. As he wrote his name, he looked at Elias and said, I'm sorry my family turned their backs on Josiah. I can't change what they did, but I can make sure we do better going forward. That's all any of us can do, Elias replied. Make sure we do better going forward. As the meeting finally broke up and people began heading home through the dark streets, Elias remained in the saloon with the 2 trunks and the ledger filled with names. He opened his uncle's final letter and read it again by lamplight. Choose wisely and choose with kindness. The world has enough anger. What it needs is justice tempered by mercy. He had chosen, and in choosing, he had discovered something his uncle probably understood in those final years, that the measure of a man wasn't in what he owned or what had been taken from him, but in how he responded when given the power to shape other people's futures. Lucky Thorne had been given that power, and he had used it to build rather than destroy, to unite rather than divide, to honor the past while creating a better future. That, he thought as he extinguished the lamp and prepared to head home, was worth more than 7,000 acres of land. 6 months later, Elias stood in the town square on a cool morning in early spring. watching as Frank Hutchins and Pete Morrison carefully positioned a bronze plaque on a stone monument that had been constructed specifically for this purpose. The plaque bore an inscription that had been debated, revised, and finally approved by the Trust Board. In memory of Josiah Morrison, 1805 to 1888, rightful owner of the land upon which Redemption Springs was built. He was wronged by corruption, sustained by dignity, and vindicated by truth. May his story remind us that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that a community's strength lies in its willingness to face uncomfortable truths with honest hearts. The schoolhouse was having its dedication ceremony that afternoon, a proper building with real classrooms, good windows, and enough space for Clara Hendricks to finally teach the way she had always wanted to. The medical clinic would open next month, staffed 3 days a week by a young doctor from Santa Fe who was eager to serve a growing community. Work had begun on improving the water system, grading the roads, all the infrastructure improvements that transformed Redemption Springs from a rough frontier town into something that might last generations. All of it funded by the Trust, by contributions from families who had chosen to make things right, rather than fight over who had been wronged. The payments had been assessed fairly, with wealthier landowners contributing more and those with less paying what they could afford. 3 families who truly couldn't pay had been given their land free and clear, their deeds recorded with the notation that this was done in the spirit of Josiah Morrison's final request, that justice be tempered with mercy. Augustus Webb had spent months working with territorial officials, carefully documenting the historical record and negotiating a formal recognition that the 1863 court ruling had been corrupt. The territorial government had issued a public acknowledgement of the injustice, not an apology exactly, as all the officials involved were long dead, but an official statement that went into the permanent record. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was truth, acknowledged. Catherine Morrison approached Elias as he stood looking at the plaque. She carried a basket covered with a cloth, and her expression was peaceful. "I thought you might be here early," she said. "I brought breakfast. Seemed fitting to share a meal before the ceremony." They sat on a bench near the new monument, and Catherine unpacked bread, cheese, and cold chicken, while Elias poured coffee from the thermos she had brought. "Pete told me he's been reading Josiah's journals," Catherine said, "the ones you allowed to be placed in the Trust archive. He says it's strange, learning about a great-uncle he never knew, but also feeling like he's understanding his own grandfather better. The shame that man carried his whole life. Pete says it makes sense now, knowing what the family had done." "Your husband's family didn't do anything wrong," Elias said. "They were just caught up in something larger than any of them. They chose to turn their backs on Josiah when he needed family most," Catherine corrected gently. "That was wrong, even if they believed they had good reasons at the time. But Pete is determined that this generation will do better, and I'm proud of him for that." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the town wake up around them. Elias thought about the meeting 6 months ago, how frightened and angry everyone had been, how impossible a good resolution had seemed. Yet here they were, not perfect but better, not without scars but healing. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked. "You could have walked away wealthy, could have sued the territory for compensation, and lived comfortably for the rest of your days." Elias considered the question. "I suppose I could have, but I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. My uncle spent 40 years carrying the weight of injustice alone. I couldn't spend the rest of my life profiting from that same injustice just because the opportunity presented itself." He looked at the plaque with his uncle's name carved in bronze. "This matters more. Knowing that people will remember him as someone who was wronged, not someone who was worthless, that matters more than money." By afternoon, the square was filled with people gathered for the dedication ceremony. Reverend Thomas spoke about the importance of facing difficult truths. Clara Hendricks talked about teaching children the real history of their town, not a sanitized version that ignored uncomfortable facts. Walter Brennan, who had been elected chairman of the trust board, laid out the plans for continued community improvements and explained how the trust would operate in perpetuity, ensuring that the land always served the community rather than being controlled by individuals. When it was Elias's turn to speak, he walked to the front of the crowd and stood beside the monument. He looked at the faces, watching him, some of the same people who had laughed at Lucky Thorne and his $5 inheritance just 6 months ago. But they weren't laughing now. They were listening, respectful, grateful for the path he had chosen. "My uncle Josiah left me 2 inheritances," Elias began. "The first was land, legally mine but morally complicated. The second was wisdom, written in his final letter to whoever found his trunks. He told me to choose with kindness, to remember that the world needs justice tempered by mercy. I've tried to honor that wisdom in everything we've done here." He paused, looking at the monument. "What we've built together these past months isn't just about righting an old wrong. It's about creating something new, a community that's stronger because we face truth together. That's more just because we chose equity over expedience. That's more whole because we recognize that everyone's dignity matters, not just those who happen to hold power." As he spoke, Elias realized something that hadn't been clear to him 6 months ago: the mockery in that saloon, the laughter at his $5 inheritance that had been a gift in its own way. It had stripped him down to who he really was, forced him to confront questions about worth and dignity that he might otherwise never have faced. And when he was given the power to reshape the town, he had already learned the lesson that mattered most: that a person's value isn't measured by their wealth or status, but by how they treat others when they have the choice to do otherwise. The ceremony ended with the unveiling of the plaque, bronze catching the afternoon sun, Josiah Morrison's name shining for all to see. As people moved toward the new schoolhouse for the dedication there, Elias remained by the monument for a few moments longer. He pulled the $5 bill from his pocket, the same bill that had started this entire journey, carefully preserved through everything that had happened. He looked at it for a long moment, thinking about how such a small thing had led to such large consequences. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a small metal box that had been built into the base of the monument, designed to hold artifacts for future generations. Alongside it, he placed his uncle's final letter. Someday, perhaps decades or centuries from now, someone might open this box and find these items. They would read about a man who turned $5 into something far more valuable than money, into justice, into community, into the kind of story that reminds people what it means to choose wisely and choose with kindness. Elias stood up, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the schoolhouse where his neighbors were waiting. He was no longer Lucky Thorne, the town joke. He was simply Elias Thorne, a man who had been given a choice and made it well. And that, he thought as the spring sun warmed his shoulders, was inheritance enough for any man.